Thanks for downloading from Digital Mindfulness. This is episode 52. Welcome to the show. This week, my guest is the UX designer, author and researcher Golden Krishna. In this interview, we talk about Golden's path to writing his best-selling book, The Best Interface is No Interface, the origins of his name, and how designers need to think about the future of digital design. Golden, who works at Google, helping to shape the future of Android, has also spent time in innovation and design departments at Zappos and Samsung. His talks on no interface have become extremely popular online, and now he'll share his insights with us. I hope you enjoy this interview with Golden Krishna. So Golden, welcome to Digital Mindfulness, and thank you so much for being here. It's a real pleasure to have you on the show finally.
Thank you so much for having me here. It's really a pleasure.
So Golden, I have to start with this, but your name is fabulous. Where does it come from? What is the origin story behind your name?
I have to thank my parents. This is not something that I came up with later in life as a sort of stage name. I am the third of three boys, and by the time my parents got to me, they got a little more creative. And my dad would tell you a story that's probably 20 minutes long with a lot of detail, and it's the story I knew for most of my life. But then actually earlier this year, my mom told me another alternate story, which is about 2 sentences long. So you choose which you think is reality. But to sum up the story my dad has told me most of his life is that, he, and this is really evident, growing up, he is sort of obsessed with math, and he loves to just solve complex math problems, and it's something he does in his leisure time. It's not something I do in my leisure time, but it's something that he is completely fascinated by. And so when he was naming us, he had all sorts of combinations of different letters, different number of characters, the letter your name starts with or ends with. And he says, algorithmically, he came up with a name that needed to be 6 letters long and start with a G. And they came up with Golden. And that's a story I knew for decades in my life. And then earlier this year, actually, my mom said to me, she said, actually, we had a friend who had the last name Goldman, and we thought that sounded cool, so we just called you Golden.
That was absolutely fascinating. So I'm wondering now about not only your route to UX design, but just your particular take on it and how you came to write The Best Interface is No Interface. What was your particular journey to UX design, and particularly your perspective on the idea that the best interface is no interface?
Yeah, so I started really my design career when I went to CalArts. It's California Institute of the Arts, it's an art school in Southern California that was started by the Disney family. And they wanted to sort of recreate this sort of Bauhaus-like feeling where there's lots of different things in one building. So there's theater and design and music. And the design program is incredibly rigorous. There's only, in my year, there's about 16 people accepted. And then each year, the sort of less performing students are asked to leave. So you dwindle down each year, and we graduated with about 12 people. It's probably one of the only few schools that doesn't take pride in retaining people, but actually like a reality show almost, sort of asks them to leave when it isn't working out, almost like a cooking show like Chopped or something like that. But it's incredibly stressful, but it also leads to great growth and builds a sort of criticality in everyone that's attending. And then, I was looking for a job when there was a down economy. And I got really lucky to get a job with Alan Cooper at a design consultancy here in San Francisco called Cooper. And if you don't know Alan Cooper, he's one of the earlier pioneers of interaction design. Actually, he was using the term interaction design long before other people were. And he's often credited with being the father of personas, which is a way to aggregate qualitative research into a sort of fictional person so that people can understand the audience they're designing for. And Alan was really known for his incredible, bombastic statements and ability to get people to think differently. I heard a coworker. I talked to a coworker there named Doug Lemoyne, who's a fantastic designer who told me about the first time he met Alan, and Doug was working at this the tech museum in San Jose, and Alan was there to be a guest speaker. And he got up in front of the audience and he pulled up his PowerPoint presentation. And in the audience was a room full of donors. So there was people from Microsoft, people from Adobe, people from all sorts of Silicon Valley companies who were donors to the tech museum. And Alan was going up there to talk about personas and interaction design. And he pulled up his PowerPoint presentation. At that time, there was no keynote, and it crashed right away. And Alan asked, "Hey, is anyone here from Microsoft?" A few people raised their hands. And Alan said, he didn't, before he even said, he stood up on the table and he pointed at them and he said, "You should be ashamed of yourselves." And that's the kind of thing that Alan was known for, was these sort of incredible statements to try to push the field forward. And so Alan really embodied that in the people that he hired at Cooper and the sort of culture that he helped create. So while I was there, I was encouraged to write in Cooper's blog. And it's something I think a lot of companies do, writing in blogs for largely marketing purposes. But at Cooper, they do something where it's more peer-reviewed, not in a totally academic journal way, but when you write something, your other peers review it, and then it goes up. So it's a little more rigorous, and it used to be something before the web that was a pamphlet they would mail out, and that was the Cooper Journal. Now being a blog, I think it plays in the same space as things that are a little less rigorous, so maybe it loses some emphasis there. But I got an opportunity to write in the journal a number of times, and I just kept experimenting with different kinds of pieces and different kinds of areas of opportunity I thought we had. But after working in doing that for a number of years, I started to realize a sort of awful trend that was going on inside the space, and that's that so many companies were trying to innovate, but they were innovating inside a rectangle. We'd go out and we'd do this incredible user research. We'd talk to people from across the country, across the world, and we'd learn about their problems. And we'd find incredible ways and new ways to solve those problems. But oftentimes clients, and they were largely reacting to the way the industry was thinking, and it does largely think still today, in that they wanted to know what their app was going to look like to solve those problems, what their website was going to do to solve those problems, when really user experience design is something that's much larger than just the digital experience. And so I ended up writing The Best Interface is No Interface. I thought it was going to be about 400 words in a blog post that no one was going to care about. And I wrote it in a pretty aggressive, sort of fun way. And it just really exploded online. I hate to measure things in value by the number of tweets or something like that they get, but this particular piece got a few thousand overnight, and it became the most tweeted design piece ever written up to that point. And it just got everywhere. And I had put a little link at the bottom to vote for The Best Interface is No Interface to be a talk at South by Southwest, which is a huge conference here in Austin, Texas. And I had never spoken at a conference before. I'd never given a talk anywhere. And I didn't think anyone was even going to care about this piece. But so many people read it. And so many people clicked the link that I ended up in that following March getting put into the largest room a voted speaker can get into with the largest amount of time. So I had never spoken anywhere. I had never spoken anywhere, and I got put in a room with 1,500 seats and given an hour time slot. Um, and that's a kind of crazy thing amount of time to fill if you've never and don't know how to prepare a lecture for that kind of audience. And I had these unreal flight delays traveling from California to Texas. I was delayed for 36 hours, which doesn't even really make sense. And I ended up getting there 2 in the morning, the day of my talk. And then once I, and it was daylight savings, so it was more like 3 in the morning. And then I got on stage and I was so nervous and so tired. I had about a 45-minute talk. I forgot 15 minutes of it on stage. So it was 30 minutes with 30 minutes Q&A. And I don't know if you've given a 30-minute Q&A, but things get pretty deep after 30 minutes of questions. I think someone was asking me about Judgment Day in Terminator by the end of the 30 minutes. So we got kind of crazy, but it went incredibly well. And one of the really bizarre things about South by Southwest is that while you're talking, there's so many other good talks happening. And so people are voting with their feet, and you can see people leaving or coming. If you're giving a talk that's not going well, people are exiting the room. If you're giving a talk that is going well, people are coming into the room. And the talk was going incredibly well. And so we went from 1,500 to 1,600, something much larger than that, because we filled up all the aisles. There were 4 or 5 rows of people standing in the back. I couldn't see past row 20, so I couldn't tell you exactly how many people were in the room, but it was jam-packed, and wall to wall, end to end. And that was pretty incredible. And after I gave the talk, I started getting a lot of sort of media attention, and I remember going to brunch, and these are sort of the early days of The Verge, which is, I think, today the sort of the technology blog or news source. And I went to brunch and I refreshed the page, or actually at that time it was the app, and my picture was on the front page of Verge. And at that time, I had just switched jobs to start working at Samsung at an R&D lab. And the only reason I got that job at the Samsung R&D lab is because I wrote the blog post. And after I wrote the blog post, they thought, hey, we need to bring some of this thinking to Samsung. And so I actually had gone to that job interview with like a big portfolio and all this show of my work. And they said, no, we don't really want to talk about this. We just want to talk about that crazy blog post that you posted up. So this so this really changed a lot in my professional career and just what was going on around me. And it wasn't long after the talk. Actually, it was almost immediately after the talk that Pearson, which is the world's largest sort of education book publisher. They're actually the largest book publisher, but a division that does technology books called Peach Pit reached out to me, and they said, "Hey, look, this is a talk that got so much attention. Actually, they hadn't even seen it. They just heard from another author who happened to be sitting in the talk that said, you need to get this guy to write a book." And so it was all really great. I mean, here I was so nervous. I forgot so much of my talk. I don't know. There's video of the talk online. Fortunately, I'm wearing a sport coat because I was definitely sweating right through my shirt. And it went really well. But I think all of this happened. I think the blog post took off, and I think the talk took off because there's this growing that's not so great at a societal level. I think something that you're really touching upon in your work is that we have become addicted to these screens, and I took the standpoint of not putting blame on, and I still believe this is true. I don't put the blame on the consumers. I put the blame on the people that are making the products that were offered. I mean, if everybody in the world is trying to solve all of your life's problems through a screen, of course you're going to spend time looking at that screen. But if people think in alternate ways, if you have other kinds of choices out there, we can sort of pull people off of screens and enhance their lives in other ways. So I think it's a methodology standpoint from a technology company's view. And so it's a different way, I think, of looking at it. And it's not about shaming. It's not about behavioral change. It's about changing the way we make products. And so I think it resonated incredibly well, and I think it still is. It's been a number of years since I first gave the talk, and the book came out just last year because there's been such a growing amount of interest, and I have a lot of startups reaching out to me to this day who are trying to go after this new kind of thinking because they see it as an opportunity space, as a growth potential. And that's great, and that's fantastic to see that to go from this really crazy thought, this sort of rambling blog post, to this lecture that got a lot of attention, to now a refined book and a lot of interest from the sort of innovation community. It feels really good.
Wow, that's a great story. And first of all, I have to give you kudos for successfully giving that talk, because as someone that gives a lot of talks and a lot of lectures, if mine was in front of the biggest room in a huge conference for an hour, then I would feel particularly daunted. But there was just so much in what you just said, and I want to pull out this whole thing about innovation and business models, and that you were talking about the way that companies first try to solve people's problems. The first way they try and do that is through a screen, and and you said that the way around that to create services and products that are much more useful is to kind of take the research, the data that they already have, which is a lot, and then not think about first going through a screen. But don't a lot of these companies that you're talking about, don't they rely on providing screen first solutions?
Well, I think because we've built our models of revenue around certain things, it's hard to see past that. Um, I sort of call the first stages of a company when they're creating these screens. I sort of call that moment when you draw that rectangle, that lazy rectangle moment, where you go up to the whiteboard or you pull out a piece of paper and you draw a rectangle and you don't think anything of it. It becomes an assumption, right? It's a fundamental assumption at the beginning of your process, of your creation process. And that is, anytime we have an assumption like that, I think you always have to question it, regardless whether what it's doing to us or not. You always have to sort of question your assumptions. But this particular assumption has led us down some interesting and I think not so great paths. And so you're saying, can companies exist if they figured out a revenue model around this lazy rectangle and they figured out ways to make money around it? And I think absolutely. I think great companies always adapt. And I've been fortunate to be in a couple of spaces now. I did it at Samsung, then I worked at Zappos for a couple of years, and I recently joined Google. And on all cases, I've been a part of these innovation groups where our job is to help the company think differently. And I think if you look across any successful company, right? I mean, look at Apple Computer. For years, for decades actually, they made personal computers. And if you were to tell them that they were going to become the world's most profitable company by not making computers, I mean, the name of their company was Apple Computer, right? And their first huge breakthrough product outside of personal computers was an iPod. And you could argue that that is a form of personal computer. That's a fair argument to make, but it's a completely different medium. And then when they go from iPod to iPhone, and smartphones are their huge revenue source. They're pretty much their primary one. Then you're talking about evolution of a company. I mean, a sort of different example that some people talk about less because people often talk about our friends in Cupertino, but at least in the media. But I think you look at something like Netflix. Netflix started as a DVD mail delivery company. The problems they were trying to solve were, how do we get envelopes that are soft enough that don't scratch discs? and that was a huge endeavor for the company. And then they needed to figure out warehouses where they could stack discs in the best way possible. They needed to find ways. They had one of their sort of challenges as a company was how do we get people to return the DVDs in a timely manner? How do we create a relationship with the post office? And these were the core problems with a DVD mail delivery company. And they're not that different to say, oh, okay, so you have a screen-based company. How do we get people to click on this thing more? How do we increase user engagement in these ways? Those are the kinds of questions you ask that are, I think, in parallel and very similar to the kinds of questions they're asking about discs. Now, of course, Netflix saw itself as an entertainment company. And by seeing itself as an entertainment company, it was able to then pivot and create a new organization that did on-demand streaming content. And actually, I think they continue to innovate in really interesting ways because they've now shifted to create another sort of way of thinking, which is original content. And in theory, that original content, man, that is so, so different in problem and in scope than what they were doing when they were mailing DVDs. So, great companies find ways to think beyond just the front end product of what they're doing today and find ways to innovate using their core brand aspects. And for Netflix, I think that's entertainment, and for other companies, it's in other ways. But you find ways to evolve, and that's how you find eventual success, because the product you make and the thing you make will get stale over time. And I don't mean stale just in the consumer's eyes, but I mean against the competition. So there are different ways of approaching the problem. It doesn't just have to be that you're making an app.
So I just want to go on from that. And you were speaking earlier about some of the companies you've worked for and particularly working with them on innovation. And I wonder whether you think that the most successful companies that we would identify with digitally, whether they have something that's unique, something that's identifiable and measurable that enables them to look at problems in a different way and solve those problems in such a way that people rush to use their products or services.
Well, I mentioned earlier the lazy rectangle moment and how that's an assumption of our process. And I think anytime you look at your assumptions and you start to question them, even the most fundamental ones, say you were trying to create I'm not sure, a new keyboard, and we assume it has to look a certain way. It's important, I think, to question those assumptions. Sort of swinging back into the book a little bit, but talking about how you innovate. There's this example I wrote about in the book where Ford was trying to figure out a new way for people to open their trunk. And they were just kind of looking at different opportunities, and a lot of car companies have launched apps to open the trunk of their car, and it's an assumption, right? It's like I make a digital experience, I make an app. Apps are convenient. Apps are going to get us good marketing. And they're gonna increase our brand value to our customer. And those are a lot of assumptions. And so they went out in the field and they looked at what it was like for people when they encountered difficult situations opening their trunk. And what they look like, and this is totally just qualitative research, just going out in the field and seeing what's happening. So you look at your assumptions. You could follow this sort of process where you look at your assumptions and then you do some qualitative research. You could do quantitative. There's a lot of different ways to test your assumptions. But what they did is they went on the field and they looked at people going towards the trunk of their car. And oftentimes the problem they encountered was they're walking out of the market, they're walking out of a store, and they had their hands full with shopping bags. And that's usually when they have their hands full are at times when they're walking towards their trunk. Because they need to be able to put these large items inside the trunk of their car. And the last thing they want to do when they have their hands full is pull out their phone, go swipe to unlock or go through all the number of steps they need to go to launch the app and find this moment inside the app in which they can unlock their trunks. It's probably about 12 steps if I walk through each and every little interaction you need to make. But they realized when people had their hands full, one thing they did is they kind of like they did this gesture where they sort of stuck their leg out to try to, even though their leg could never really open the hatch of their in this case they're looking at their SUV. You could almost stick your foot into the hatch, and so people were often doing this, and they realized, why don't we just put a sensor underneath the bottom of our bumper, and it'll look for a shin and then a kick, and then the trunk will open. And this was something that their research team ran across, and they thought, oh, that's pretty interesting feature. It's definitely falls in this category that I describe in the book, this no interface moment where you go from thinking in screens to trying to embrace people's processes. But when they released the feature the next year, the demand for that particular model was astronomical, and they had no expectation for that to happen. But then it became such a big deal, they launched an advertising campaign around it, and they realized that when you go after solving your customers' problems in such a focused manner, and you break down an assumption that every other car manufacturer is making, you can innovate. And to just talk about a trunk opening is just this very tiny example. I talked about Netflix expanding to whole new models of business, which is a different way, a different scale of thinking. But I think it's a similar kind of process where you understand what people really need, and that can come from a number of sources. But that is certainly one of the ways we can go from thinking in screens to thinking about experiences that our customers will really find delight from.
So, what would you say then are some of the positive and negative impacts on the human experience when we approach human problems from a screen first perspective?
Yeah, I mean, it's without a doubt that we're addicted to our screens, and some of the numbers are completely startling. Adults today in the United States spend about 8 hours a day looking at a screen. I think it gets even crazier when you look at teenagers who spend about 7.5 hours a day looking at a screen. And you could look at that and say, okay, oh, look, that's a half hour less than adults. But what people don't often realize when they look at that number is that teenagers are in school for most of the day. So when they're spending 7.5 hours a day looking at a screen, that means probably in all likelihood, a lot of time outside of school just staring at a screen. And whether they're Snapchatting back and forth with friends, whether they're liking 100 photos on Instagram, whatever it might be, they're spending a lot of time on screens. And even a lot of kids' toys today use screens, and that's not such a great thing. So there's a lot of research around how much we use our phones. Actually, there was a study in the UK done last year where they found that people check their phones 220 times a day on average. That's a lot of times. And I think the reason we're looking at our phones and the reason we're checking our phones all the time is because we have a lot of products and services that are buzzing and beeping in your pocket that are trying to get you to take your phone out of your pocket, that are trying to get you more addicted to that technology because they view success as the number of minutes somebody spends on their platform. And that's not how I view success. That's not where I think we should be going as an industry. I think we should be going as an industry to try to find and create experiences that are efficient, that are elegant. And I think that's what really design is about. But we've somehow muddled what we're trying to do. And instead of really bringing people's lives forward, we're trying to bring people's lives into the rectangle. And that's really unfortunate. And that's become the way we think. And I think a lot of technology companies would tell you that they're doing great, good things to the world. But I would argue that a large number of companies are trying to get you to spend more and more time looking at a screen, trying to pull your phone out of your pocket more and more often. And that is distracting us away from our friends and family. I mean, there are some really interesting studies out there. There was a study done recently around empathy, and and they took teenagers who were looking at their phones at about the average rate of most smartphone users, and they put them in the wilderness for 4 weeks. And before they put them in this camp for 4 weeks, it was just a sort of a summer camp, they measured their levels of empathy. There's a couple of ways you can measure so a person's empathy, but they measured them and they gave each person a score. Then they spent 4 weeks without their devices. That means no longer 7.5 hours a day looking at a screen. That means actually having to talk to another person. Or just enjoying nature, whatever they might want to do. And at the end of that 4 weeks, they again measured their empathy levels. And they found that these teenagers were astoundingly more empathetic. Now, this is just one study. There's been a couple of other studies out there that show similar indicators that we become far more empathetic to other people because we look at them more, we read their nonverbal communication, we're not distracted by something buzzing and beeping, we're not thinking about a second thing at the same time we're talking to somebody. And when you create a society like we are right now that becomes less empathetic over time, that's really scary because you're talking about the inability to relate to people who are different than you. And that I believe you could draw parallels um, with some of the fear and some of the misunderstandings that go on in global issues. Now that's quite a line to draw, but I do think it's an influencer on the way that we have sort of grown as a world apart and segmented into different groups, and that's quite a statement to make. But I do believe that our addiction to screens has an influence on the way we see other people and we see the world. And I think that there's been a number of studies that have shown that. We can't say it's complete fact, but certainly there are effects that are happening from just getting people addicted to screens. It seems so harmless, but that's our pollution onto the world is we're creating a less empathetic, more addicted, more distracted world.
I think you're right. And in addition to those geopolitical elements that you were talking about, from a business perspective, if our living our lives through a screen impacts on our ability to form connections and to be empathetic, then that won't only impact on business performance, but that surely will have an impact on the quality of life of both the workers and the customers that they're serving.
Oh yeah, absolutely. It even at a business level, you could argue that getting away from screens creates more seamless teams. Actually, when I was at Samsung, one of the things we didn't like to do a lot of is we didn't like to send a lot of emails to each other. Instead, we did these sort of quick team huddles where we would have these rapid huddles throughout the day instead of everyone sending emails out so that our inboxes wouldn't get crowded. And that was a really interesting strategy because I went from a world where I was getting dozens and dozens, and now I continue to get lots and lots of email, but partly because of the popularity of the book, which is a good thing. But when I was at work and we figured out this way to reduce the number of emails, and we looked at each other, our company culture inside our team, at least, grew and we bonded like we never had before because the mere fact that we were looking at each other and talking through things, then sending these sort of back and forth messages of trying to convince each other of something. There's something very different about this quick 10-minute huddle. What's going on? Let's make some quick decisions and then get back to our desks. And that's just at a company level in a small group. So there are absolutely, I think you're identifying, even at a micro level, things that happen.
And I imagine that type of thinking, the thinking that you and I have been speaking about today, would be especially useful for people using in the workplace, using things like email, because email is notorious in disrupting people's attention and their levels of productivity. So I imagine that would be especially useful.
Yeah, absolutely. The sort of constant pinging. I mean, I think email is a little different than something like Facebook or Snapchat or Twitter, where they measure success based on likes and retweets, and that is all about user activity. Um, but email has a similar kind of effect on us, feeling like we're always attached to our phones. Actually, there's this great future video from 1992 that AT&T made, and they were talking about the sort of what's going to happen with the internet and all the amazing things we can do with modems. And AT&T, being a communications company, was excited about modems, and so they made this ad where they showed a man on the beach. He's sitting in this large beach chair, and he has his fax machine next to him. He actually does have a fax machine next to him in the commercial, which is in the video, sorry, which is amazing. And they show him with a laptop, and this is the power of modems, that he can work anywhere. And how free we will become when we don't have to go to the office every day. And that was sort of the vision that they had. This is what the internet is going to bring to all of us. But what's actually happened is that by breaking that relationship between the office and our homes, by being always connected, a lot of people are always at work. So they had this vision of you're free. You can be at the beach with your fax machine to you're always checking your email. Where they're, especially in some particular fields, like in law, for example, people are sending emails back and forth at 2, 3 in the morning. Same in the financial world. They're always at work. And that's not a good thing. Instead of breaking free of the office has become, for a lot of people who are working, an all-day affair. That's not a good thing.
So, Golden, unfortunately, we've come to the end of the interview. Where can people find out more about you and your work?
There's 2 places to go. The easiest is to go to nointerface.com. That's where you can learn about the book. You can buy it on Amazon or a number of other retailers. It's actually being translated now into Chinese, Korean, Russian, and that's pretty exciting. I've been working with translators there. So it's at a number of stores across the world. In Europe, a book depository is probably the best place to buy it. But let's see. So the other place to go, you can just go to my personal website is goldenkrishna.com, and you can always follow me on Twitter, which is just at Golden Krishna. So those are, I guess, 3 places. But nointerface.com is where you'll find more about this kind of thinking and how you can get your hands on the book.
Well, Golden Krishna, congratulations on all your success, and thank you so much for spending time with us today. I'm looking forward to picking up again and having round 2 of this interview.
Oh yeah, absolutely. This has been a pleasure, and we should try to schedule a round 2.